Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. Sometimes I wonder if the debate about energy in this presidential campaign has more rhetoric than real substance. Jim Larocca is in the energy business as chair of the Long Island Power Authority. I first knew him a long time ago as the state's commissioner of energy. It's his topic and our worry, so I'm anxious to hear what he has to say. So tell us about energy. That's a big order, right?
That's a very big order, and thank you, and it's good to see you.
It's lovely to see you.
I think a good way to think about all of this is you got to go back to, let's say, the 50s. At that time, there was enough domestic production to pretty much meet our demands in this country.
Production of
petroleum,
oil.
American oil. And so much so that the American oil companies managed to get Washington to put quotas on imported oil. And so American policy for a long time was to keep foreign oil out. But as demand rose and domestic production didn't keep up, the quotas kept dropping. And by the time of the Kennedy years, the quotas were under real pressure. And they began to allow it in, especially for the Northeast, because we have a high heating oil load and so forth. From the Kennedy years to the Nixon years, that decade or so, we went from really no dependence on foreign oil to 10, 15, 18%. And by the time in the mid-70s when we had the OPEC embargo, and you and I will remember the gas lines, the gasoline lines, we found that a succession of presidents actually agreed on something. Nixon, Ford, and Carter all agreed to try to get to energy independence, meaning to push that foreign oil back out and to take care of our needs domestically, because it's a national security problem as well as an economic problem. Nixon began to make some progress. He went out, Ford continued it, Carter came in, and then
How did he make progress? Doing what?
All of the things that are being talked about right now: alternative energy production, tax changes to encourage alternative energy production, different arrangements for domestic credits, a whole, there's no one answer.
Right.
It's always a mixed bag. And then the Ayatollah Khomeini came along and threw out the Shah of Iran, who was a guy, by the way, we put into power when they did have a democracy in the early 50s. And we were back in the soup. And we lost all of that oil from Iran, and there's been a succession of missteps ever since. When Ronald Reagan became president, on his 7th day in office, he wrote an executive order canceling everything Nixon, Ford, and Carter did. He said the markets will allocate energy in the world. He believed in markets to the point of unreason. And around that time, our dependence on foreign oil was 16, 17, 18, maybe 20%. 8 years of Ronald Reagan, 4 years of George Herbert Walker Bush. When they left office, our dependence on foreign oil was almost 50%. So they went from 1 gallon in 5 to every other gallon being foreign. And of course, the price walked its way up. Unfortunately, President Clinton didn't do anything about energy that you could write home about either. And by the time he left office, our dependence on foreign oil was over 60%. Now we get the latest crowd, and it's now pushing 70%. So 7 out of every 10 gallons, more or less, depending on the season, comes to us from foreign sources. And look at the condition of those sources. It's a cartel that if it was operating in this country would be illegal. It's got every kind of despot and anti-democratic institution involved, in whether it's the Saudi royal family or this new guy down in Venezuela. So we have very foolishly, stupidly, allowed ourselves to become dependent on the rest of the world for 7 out of every 10 gallons. And how that happened and how we still let it happen is beyond my understanding as a student of political science and government. It is unnecessary. Now we have a political campaign, and everybody's talking to do about what they're going to do about energy. One way or the other, they're talking about everything that Nixon, Ford, and Carter talked about. The stuff that was in the New York State Energy Master Plan in 1978. And so we've come full circle. We're trying to do what we haven't done now for 30 years.
Just let's go back. What is it that caused the increase in the need for oil?
70% of all the oil consumed in this company is in transportation. We have, for example, on Long Island, where I live now, we have more cars than people.
Right.
A driveway in the 1950s might have had a car in it, or a station car for the dad who commuted by the railroad to now everybody in the family's got a car. Everybody in the family's probably also got a television, a stereo, and the televisions are now flat screens. All those houses are now air conditioned. So between transportation and our enormous domestic use of power, we have continued to increase our...
So as the inventions and the manufacturing became more sophisticated and
Sure.
expanded, then we needed more of the energy. But at the same time that we use it for transportation, you were also Commissioner of Transportation in the New York State, we haven't increased public transportation, have we? I mean, it seems to me
Well, we have.
We don't have a national... Do we still have a national network of rail transit, for instance?
Well, we've never done with railroads in this country what the Europeans have done, and we've never done it in suburbia the way, say, the Europeans have done. But we have to understand this culture was built on the premise of the availability of the personal automobile. Long Island's the perfect case. Westchester's the perfect case. These communities were designed in a way that you have to have a car. Try living on suburban Long Island without an automobile. It's impossible. You know, walk a mile and a half to a bus that comes every 3 hours. It doesn't work that way. So we made a sort of a condition of American values, the American dream, the American culture, the personal automobile. And we're paying a price for it.
Yeah.
Even now, at $3, $3.50, $3.75, $4, I think at one point this summer I paid $4.49.
It's incredible.
I still bought the gasoline, didn't I?
Yep, absolutely.
Now we're seeing an increase in mass transit, but it's relatively modest compared to the cost. So what Americans have decided by their actions, if not by their public policy, is they'll pay whatever the market demands before they will change their behavior in any fundamental way.
So let's now go to the presidential election. And Obama talks about alternative means of energy, finding new means, with some restricted, he admits that there may be a need for some nuclear energy, right? What does McCain do? He's for the same, he's
drill, baby, drill.
Well, that's new. But he was, well, is that a big difference, offshore drilling? Because Obama has recently said some offshore drilling. McCain's never been for Alaska.
On the North Slope of Alaska, he took the position against that, but he has made a condition of his campaign now,
Offshore.
Drill, baby, drill, meaning offshore and everywhere but the North Slope of
So
Alaska.
can explain them better than I am.
Well,
the differences.
If the idea is, in either case, that we're going to, through new domestic production, put a dent in this mess in this generation, I think they're both overpromising. Because the fact is, if we went to the kind of offshore drilling that's being talked about, particularly by the McCain campaign, you're at least 10 or 15 years away from a significant enough production to have any effect on the market as we know it. I think natural gas has to be part of this discussion as well, because North American natural gas has become, for New York, an enormous substitution for foreign oil. And Mexico and particularly Canadian gas is a much more attractive proposition for us than LNG from Nigeria.
Where does natural gas come from?
It comes from deep in the earth, and very often the same pockets in the earth that formed petroleum. And a lot of it that we get here in the Northeast comes from the Gulf of Mexico, from Canada, used to come and is coming again from places like Western New York, where the dollars have gotten rich enough that these stripper wells and there's something called Marcellus Shale, where you have to go into the shale a certain way. So markets do bring some of this forward, but the mistake we have made nationally is that we've become too dependent on one source, and that's oil, and within that, too dependent on foreign oil.
I'm so glad you're here, because you're defining all these different things. There is an oil pipeline from Alaska down through the United States?
Well, when you remember
was
a generation
during Nixon,
ago.
or when was that?
That started
Before?
at least in that time, sure.
Yeah.
That's when the North Slope first began and the Alaskan pipeline was built.
And then there's a natural gas pipeline being built or being planned?
Well, to listen to Governor Palin, you'd think it was being built at the moment. It's actually not, but it is apparently committed, but that requires some examination. There's a lot of gas up there. and there's environmental issues surrounding that pipeline, as there were with the oil pipeline. But in any event, North American supplies are, at least for the first part of the discussion, a very attractive idea compared to the alternatives.
Absolutely.
Now, you know, there was talk of building this Broadwater liquefied natural gas facility in Long Island Sound. Governor Patterson put an end to that. This was to take gas from Nigeria, one of the most unstable places, put it on ships by freezing it, bringing it to this floating thing that's longer than 3 football fields, and then regasifying it under a pipeline and so forth. So that's scary to a lot of people, and the governor properly said that Long Island Sound wasn't the right place for this. But that is an alternative to bringing more North American gas. When I see that comparison, I say North American every time.
Yeah.
There's no perfect energy solution, and there's an environmental downside to almost everything you do. Even the more attractive alternative stuff has its own downsides. But it's a comparative analysis, and I think where national security requires that we try to get off the dependence from these foreign sources that do not have our best interests at heart, then I tend to opt for the North American solution.
So this makes even more important our diplomatic relationships with different countries. I mean, we have not done very well, have we, in the Americas during these last administrations?
Well, we could go right down the list of OPEC countries. Yeah. We tend to look the other way when it comes to Saudi Arabia, who treats women abominably, and they can't drive cars and they can't vote and all the rest, while forging ahead with democracy in neighboring Iraq. So, I mean, there's no consistency.
I was really
there.
Thinking about South America.
South America, you know, Venezuela, when OPEC began, and the embargo that many people refer to as the Arab embargo of the 1970s, was actually brought, OPEC was really midwifed by Venezuela, and the embargo actually originated with as much of the push from Venezuela as from the Arabian Gulf. And Venezuela is still like 18 or 19 or 20% of our domestic consumption. So, you know, we've had people in South America we haven't liked before, and will again. We need to figure out the commerce of this stuff, because, I mean, who do you pick from? Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, or Venezuela? These are not ideal regimes in any case. We need to figure out how to do this.
Let's go back now to alternative uses, or alternative sources of energy. If we were to do all of it, would we be able to replace the foreign oil? Incrementally.
You have to do so many things at once. Where the Congress has over the years, and maybe again, made its biggest contribution was by the imposition of efficiency standards for vehicles. Because that is science, that is engineering, those things can be achieved. The industry doesn't like to do it, but it can be done. And part of the progress we made was in those efficiency standards. The problem was we were all fat, dumb, and happy during the boom years, and we kept buying bigger and bigger machines. You and I remember Cadillacs with fins.
Right.
Well, have you seen an Escalade lately? A Cadillac Escalade?
Yeah.
It's a truck, you know, as long as a bus, and that uses a lot of petroleum. So we as a people, whatever we're saying politically, contradicted all that by buying these things. There's an SUV now in every driveway, and they're only leaving gradually now that things have tightened up again. So we have to reconcile what we think we mean with what we actually mean. And we haven't done that yet.
And if we came down, and then when you look at all the highways and roads, I mean, it's astonishing. And in any big city in the country that I've been in, it's the same thing. Just rows and rows, lines and lines of cars.
Sure.
So then the question goes, do you build more roads, or do you do something with public transportation?
Well, you do both. In effect, you do both. Public transportation operates with subsidy every place it exists in the United States of America.
Yeah.
Right here in New York, you don't pay the full cost of a ride, and I don't pay the full cost of a ride on MTA.
I especially don't, because I know half fare, but anyway.
Okay. But that's a choice we make as a society, that we're going to take monies from elsewhere, general revenues, other taxes, and put them into our transit system. I wrote an op-ed 25 years ago for the Daily News calling for a zero fare. If we're going to subsidize the fare at 30% or 50%, why not 100%? And you know the answer was from MTA? If we did that, too many people would ride mass transit. so
Well, that's
I don't
an
know.
interesting thing now.
Yeah, and Ted Keel was, I think, the first to talk
Yeah.
about that. And so every transit system in the country is subsidized to some extent. There are some free systems in the resort places, like the ski places in Colorado, and I think in downtown
Denver,
and San Antonio.
And the convention in Denver, free, this bus, it was an amazing thing.
Just for the convention, I think.
No.
All
It
the
goes
time?
down the main street. Yeah.
Yeah, well, there's
It's
part of an
wonderful.
answer.
You just get on and off at every block it stops, and that was it.
But it's not free. It's just no charge to you as a
right.
user, but it's being paid for from other revenues. We don't charge to go into Central Park. It's picked up, the cost of that is picked up elsewhere in our revenue system. So why do we charge to go in the subway but not to go
get
into
to
the
the
park?
park, yeah.
It's just a choice we make.
Yeah.
And I would favor over time that if we really mean it about mass transit, we should be lowering the cost of mass transit, and people will come
And
if it
increasing.
is cheap enough.
Right.
And the alternatives get more expensive, at least comparatively, if there were higher taxes shared by the whole population. We're getting the benefit of fewer cars, more people on mass transit. But politically, I remember a certain governor that you and I knew well reading my op-ed piece and saying, "Have you lost your mind?"
Then let's go to wind. What's that? What's the downside of that?
Wind is
Space
almost
and noise.
it's almost like real estate. Location, location, location.
Yeah.
You need a certain amount of wind on a certain reliable basis in order to justify the expense of these large contraptions, and they are big
They're
contraptions.
big, and they make a lot of noise, don't they? Or does
They
that
make
not-
noise. They make
yeah.
some noise. I visited them years ago, and last year we were in California. We went out to the one out near Palm Springs.
yeah.
And, if you've got a landscape that you don't mind inhabiting with
yeah.
these things, and they're miles and
Yes,
miles and miles,
interesting.
and you have a wind pattern that supports the economics, then they're attractive. This thing that LIPA, which I now chair, came up with for the South Shore, the numbers didn't work, not even close. And then when I came in and the new president of LIPA came in, we put an end to that. We couldn't get a hold of the real numbers, and the wind on the South Shore of Long Island comes up in the late afternoon in the summer. On hot and muggy days. So in terms of its being available on a fuller basis, it didn't work, at least in our judgment. But there are other propositions. The mayor has talked about some, may or may not make sense. Some propositions in upstate New York. There you have a real balancing act to do between environmental impact, and in my view, the aesthetics are just as important as the other environmental impacts, and the real economics for something that is by definition intermittent.
Right. What about nuclear energy? You don't. Nuclear, not nuclear.
Nuclear.
It's a Republican way of.
They will figure out how to pronounce it.
And the
sooner or
president has never. I
later. He
mean,
never
Bush
got
has never
it, and
figured it out.
Governor Palin apparently
Yeah.
can't get it. In 1978, we wrote the first New York State Energy Master Plan. There were 7 nukes proposed for New York State. The numbers were going through the roof. Shoreham, which just about sunk the economy of Long Island, certainly sunk the economics of Lilco and created LIPA, which I now chair. We said no more nukes for New York because nobody was accounting for the nuclear wastes. Out in West Valley, New York, we had a nuclear waste dump with high level liquid nuclear waste in carbon steel tanks that were rusting. The state and the federal government, by the way, from the late 70s till now has spent over $1 billion trying to eliminate West Valley nuclear waste. The problem with nuclear power as it was being advocated then is it didn't account for the back end of the cycle. And it's not reasonable to say, well, nuclear is cheaper if you're not paying for the whole part of it. What do you do with the leftovers? So now I see it's back. Certainly McCain has been promoting it. I don't personally take a position automatically against it. Again, location, location, location. Long Island was wrong for it. Metropolitan New York. There may be isolated locations where communities will accept it. That is to be determined. Community along Lake Ontario, where there are 3 in one location and 1 further over, those communities sought those.
And where does the waste go?
The waste still is being held. The companies pay an enormous amount of money to the federal government, who is supposed to be providing for the long-term disposal of nuclear waste. But the cycle is, they have not accounted for it from cradle to grave yet, and it is still piled up in these pools. The spent rods sit in pools. The liquid waste that were produced in the plutonium cycle sat in tanks, and in some cases still sit in tanks.
The concept of increasing the use of nuclear plants without finding an answer for the waste.
If you don't have the waste cycle dealt with.
I remember being in New Mexico. It was an enormous controversy because they were going to even, I think, just bring it through.
Right, and they want to put it in salt domes in Nevada.
It's terrible.
All of that, I think, should be part of the discussion. But unless there's a full accounting for all of the costs of the cycle, then I don't think it makes any sense. And it's not the panacea that's now being advertised. And you see nuclear power is being seen as environmentally attractive. That bears examination. We have this thing now called clean coal. That requires some skepticism as well. So all of these things, I think, the accounting to make it comparable in terms of the relative economics, you have to look at the cost from beginning to end, and then you can have a real comparison.
And then what about ethanol? I've never understood that. Never. That's always a big issue in Iowa, or at least it was
throughout the Midwest. Yeah. Ethanol is, as it's currently used, an additive to domestic gasoline. It is heavily subsidized because the corn crop is heavily subsidized. That's politics. That's not economics.
Yeah.
And
so it's the subsidy for it that's the basic political
Well, it's subsidized
issue.
In clever ways through tax and other ways. But the point is that corn as a food cost is raised, and actually because of the way we do ethanol in this country, we have an effect on worldwide
food.
And then down in Brazil, they do ethanol different ways, perhaps better than we do. But the point is, nothing is in isolation anymore. But ethanol has basically been a political sop, and you can remember a couple of candidates who've gone to Iowa saying, "I don't like this ethanol." They quickly get religion
and get off to it.
Yeah.
So for every proposed solution, we have to look beyond what they're proposing as to the effects of it.
Oh, sure.
Right. Now, you also are, is energy considered a subsection of the environment, of environmental studies? Is energy part of it? Or is
I think they're...
Well, we used to talk about the environment. Now we seem to be talking about energy, but it's all together. Global warming would fit into what?
Sure.
Where does it fit in? Energy and... I mean, are they interchangeable?
The Chinese are adding coal plants at the rate of something like one a week.
Yeah.
Okay, and they're not clean coal by any means. The prevailing winds are westerly. They're emissions across the Pacific and so on. So no, there's no separating the two. There is no perfect energy solution, and there is a downside to everything we do. People don't like to hear this, but we have far more control than we realize, but we don't exercise it. We can do more as individuals to regulate our own energy use, to manage it, than we do. We don't want to, and that's okay, as long as we understand the consequences of our choices. And I'm as bad as anybody else.
But if I want to do it, and you're not doing it, then what do I do?
There's still a benefit to you. If you can manage your household perhaps differently, your choice of automobile, your choice of travel patterns, all of those things, when you buy an appliance, spend a little more if you can up front for the more energy efficient. So there's a lot of choices that we as consumers make all the time. That doesn't mean that's an answer either, but conservation is part of any solution. And conservation, I used to argue, is its own reward, because a dollar I don't spend on energy is a full dollar I've saved.
Yeah.
It's 100% of the dollar I get to keep. But what's happened over the years is government is seen as sort of a nag. And Jimmy Carter didn't help, even though his heart was in the right place, by sort of lecturing the country. The country doesn't like to be lectured about how they drive, wearing a sweater, turning down their thermostats. But the reality is that a lot of conservation in small businesses, in larger businesses, office buildings in New York, you can remember during the period of the 70s when at night New York was much less lit than it is now. Now you see office buildings completely lit all night long. Because
why isn't there a law for that or regulation?
Well, here it comes back to what should we be doing in our own interest, and what should we be doing as a matter of governmental mandate. One of the things that happened with Ronald Reagan's approach, which has never really been contradicted, taking government out of energy policy, was letting the market do its thing, was to basically deregulate and let people make these choices. So on the one hand, we have made the choice to use more. Politically, we're unhappy about it when we see the consequences, but we don't really go the other way. So I don't like to sound like one of those guys who say it's our own fault, and in many respects it's not, because national policy has been incoherent for a generation now on all of this. But the choices we can make, and now if I could pitch for the Long Island Power Authority for a minute, we have programs to assist consumers, as does New York Power Authority, as do the other utilities, mandated in part by the PSC, mandated by common sense in other cases, where we can assist homeowners, we can assist small businesses. There are even tax and other treatments available for certain kinds of investments. So we've done a lot of the public policy stuff, but we as consumers have not embraced it nearly as much as we need to.
I have to say goodbye to you because it's the end of the program, but this has been so interesting,
well,
and I've learned so much.
It's
so
always
thank
good
you
to
very
see you.
much.
We should do this again.
We have to. Thanks.
Okay, Ronnie.
If there are any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore, please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.